Hi, everybody. How you doing? It's Bob once again here to talk about Meilants and the chapter that you guys are reading for this week, Perspectives on the Origins of Merchant Capitalism in Europe. So we are going to, I'm going to share my screen here in a second. We're going to go through this article piece by piece, give you a sense of how to approach some of these topics, to how to do a little bit of analysis, and also to kind of provide some context for what Meilants is talking about. I hope you guys are enjoying the class so far. I hope Mr. Pritchard isn't being too mean to you, but all the best, and we'll jump right in. Please, Mr. Bouchard, pause the video at any point if anybody's got questions or if you feel like you need to. I will kind of try to stagger some pauses in there to make it a little bit easier to navigate. All right, let's get started. So, share that screen. All right. So when we're looking at an article like or a book chapter like this entitled Perspectives on the Origins of Merchant Capitalism, what we're looking at, in short, is a overview of how a bunch of different schools of thought or perspectives, as he puts it, view the origin of capitalism in Europe, view the subject. Some of these schools of thought will agree on certain points, some of them will disagree on certain points, or simply have a different perspective. And what Meilants is going to do is he's going to walk us through each of these schools that he kind of sees as the most valuable. And he's going to show us like what is valuable to take from them. And in some cases, what should be left behind, right? This is what's known as historiography, the study of the study of history, or in other words, an analysis of the study of history, how we do our jobs. So as he begins, he says there are four major theoretical perspectives on the origins of capitalism in medieval Europe. He's going to look through all four of them. You've got orthodox Marxism, a form of neo-Marxism that he calls Brennerism, the modernization theory, and the world systems analysis. Don't worry, we're going to go through each one of them in turn. All of these share the quality of being, at their core, Marxist. And I want to explain what that means first. Marx was an economist and a historian who emerged in the 1840s in Germany. He was part of what I would kind of consider the second generation of socialists. The first generation were the socialists who formed the French Commune in the 1830s and really came up out of the foment of the French Revolution in the 1780s and 90s, saw the limitations of that revolution and sought to take the working class alliance within the city of Paris that had begun that movement to its full fruition to take over the state. They emerged as a kind of understood movement in the 1830s during what's known as the Orleanist Revolution. If any of you have seen the musical Les Miserables, that is all about the emergence of that first generation of socialists. Marx is of the second generation. Marx is of the generation that no longer views socialism or is taking socialism to another level, no longer sees it as a discrete method, like a specific localized method to resist capital, but rather as part of an internationalist movement, not just in terms of oh yes, well, so obviously other workers will have sympathy for us, but truly Marx was purporting that socialism could not survive without an international revolution against capital, that capital would necessarily sow the seeds of its own destruction by immiserating the working class. Marxism, orthodox, neo-Marxism, modernization, and world systems analysis all originate from his thinking. Marx believed that the driving force of history were the modes of production of a society, the social relationships that emerged out of those modes of production, the methods by which people survived their exploitation or resisted it, and the methods by which the dominant class attempted to make people believe that a better future was not possible, right? And so what we have is the structure in the modes of production and the social relationships, and we have the superstructure that emerges in the competition between workers and the bourgeoisie over who controls culture. That's what's known as the superstructure. So you have the structure, which is how things are made and how profit and surplus is generated and how it is appropriated. And then you have the superstructure, which is how that process is understood by the people participating in it. In other words, culture. So the orthodox Marxists have always looked at the emergence of capitalism as being one stage of a multi-stage process. This is what he means when he says stagist evolution, right? That human beings started out as living in communitarian societies, or what Marx called primitive communism, where everything was shared equally among everybody else. You have the emergence out of those communitarian societies of what he calls the ancient mode of production, which is entirely built on slave labor. Slaves are the backbone and bedrock of production. They produce all of the necessary food, most of the necessary luxuries, right? They produce, even in the case of Rome, producing most of the art and literature and philosophy, right? Slaves are the producers of not only the structural necessities within the Roman Empire, they're also, ironically, the producers of the superstructure within Rome at the behest of their masters. And that is what Marxists would call a slave society, a society that is dependent for its production on slaves. And Rome becomes the kind of the most extreme version of this ancient mode of production dependent on slavery. We often think of Rome as a height of civilization, which I think is absolutely hilarious because it is an empire built on blood and pain and exploitation and horror, the likes of which it would be difficult for us to imagine. That system falls apart. That mode of production is not sustainable forever. And when the Roman Empire collapses in the 4th and 5th centuries after the death of Christ, you have the emergence of this new mode of production called feudalism. Feudalism comes out of the inability of these new local elites, these new local kings, to have the same kind of military power and be able to threaten the same kind of overwhelming violence that Rome could threaten. The Roman Empire was a very well-oiled bureaucratic military machine. It had an army of 500,000 people. It could put those military forces wherever they needed to go within their borders. There are hundreds, literally, of revolts against Rome. All of them are crushed until finally barbarian invasions overwhelm the capacity of the state to resist them, and the empire simply collapses. But Rome was very good at putting down rebels. There was one of the most famous rebels was a guy named Spartacus, who led a servile rebellion in the 1st century BC. He and his followers were crucified. They were not simply killed by the Roman army. They were staked to lamp posts by their hands and feet every mile along the Appian Way, which ran from the toe of Italy all the way to Rome. That was on purpose. And that was done because Rome had the capacity to do it. They had that military force that they could call upon, paid professional soldiers. Once that state apparatus collapses, no one's there to pay the soldiers. The army falls apart. There's no bureaucracy to collect taxes. It devolves into local rulers who don't have that kind of power. And what emerges out of that is feudalism, where you have a new compromise position between serfs, who are the laborers, the kind of inheritors, the descendants of the formerly enslaved, who work the land and produce everything of necessity for the society. And instead of owners, you now have lords, landlords, who claim to control the land and a portion, not the whole, as they did in the ancient world, but a portion of what the peasants produce. That's feudalism roughly as it emerges in the 6th century. That lasts for a very long time. It is an incredibly stable system. It comes to its full fruition in the 12th and 13th centuries. It begins to start to get into some problems of over exhaustion of soil in the 14th century, right about the time that the greatest plague that has ever hit Europe hits Europe. The Black Death, which kills 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Europe. It takes an already weak system and begins its inexorable decline. And feudalism begins to decline as a mode of production very slowly in the 15th century. And what is starting to grow up to replace it in especially the Mediterranean, specifically northern Italy, are these new forces of commerce and capital, of profit-driven trading and mercantile activity that is centered around the Mediterranean, trading spices from the east for goods from Europe and back and forth, collecting profit, reinvesting those profits. This capitalism, with its elite of who are not landed lords, they're not aristocrats, they don't have castles, they have counting houses, they have banking houses, they have offices where clerks write down sums of money coming in and out. They are known as the bourgeoisie, and they're the elite of this new system, of this new mode of production called capitalism. And from the 15th century all the way up until the 17th century, you have a contention between feudalism, the old forces of the land and custom, against these new forces of capitalism that are emerging and challenging their power. The last stage of human development, according to Marx, was going to be socialism. That capitalism, like all systems before it, would sow the seeds of its own destruction. The ancient world, with its gigantic enslaved population, had sown the seeds of its own destruction in creating this incredibly rickety bureaucratic system that rested upon the production of people who were so profoundly immiserated that they had no reason not to rebel. And eventually those rebellions built up and built up and built up and became more and more costly over time. And then the second you have external pressure, the so-called barbarians, the entire state system collapses. Likewise, feudalism created the seeds of its own destruction in not being able to deal with money very effectively. Feudalism is a system that depends upon peasants producing food, a proportion of that food being taken and appropriated by the landlords, and then the landlords using that surplus to pay for luxuries that they want: pepper, cinnamon, other kinds of spices, expensive wines, whatever, and pay for the artisans that maintained their status, the people that built their castles, the people that maintained their armor, the people that bred their horses. But that system can't account for the merchant. It doesn't have a place for the merchant. And so throughout the Middle Ages, merchants always lived kind of outside of and on the fringes of and in between medieval society. They were called the middling sort, right? They were neither fish nor fowl, right? They were neither lord nor peasant. What the hell were they? They were necessary, but they were often looked down upon as being somewhat subversive or dangerous. A lot of Jewish people in the Middle Ages inhabited this role because they could do so more safely than they could as simply a peasant, right? They had an opportunity to do well for themselves and build up networks. This begins to become a real problem for feudalism once the Mediterranean opens up as a source of commercial income. When trade between the Muslim states and the Christian states of Western Europe begins to become more and more valuable. Suddenly, you have bankers in Italy and bankers in southern Germany, and then bankers in Holland by the 16th century, who are wealthier by far than any of their landed aristocratic neighbors. By the time the 15th century rolls around, Florentine money counters are telling landed Italian lords what to do. And there's very little those Italian lords can do to stop them. They have so much more money than they do. And so capitalism starts to metastasize in northern Italy and spread throughout the river valleys of Germany and the river valleys of France and up into England and Holland, and it's what's called the Spanish Netherlands, what's now called Belgium, and along the coasts of Spain. And this new system of production becomes the dominant mode after a series of titanically destructive wars, which we'll talk about. But likewise, capitalism is also sowing the seeds of its own destruction, because in order for capitalism to produce profit for the bourgeoisie, it has to exploit the workers who produce that value, right? The people that work in the factories, the people that work in the fields, the people that produce the commodities that are to be sold for profit, they are exploited. They are paid far less than they produce, if they're paid at all. Violence is used to keep them in line. And we're going to talk about how violence looks different in the capitalist world than it did in the feudal world. And those people have no inherent reason to obey the state. They have no inherent reason to truckle at the feet of the institutions that treat them like garbage. They're you, effectively. You are workers, or you're going to be workers one day. And these people who are being exploited in the 15th century have the very similar position within their mode of production as it was emerging. And they have the same kinds of gripes, and they have the same kinds of vices. And they have people say about them the same things that people today say about kids from Holyoke, right? And we're going to talk about why that is. We're going to talk about the development of that classist, racist ideology. So that class of workers, that proletariat, all of us, we have nothing but an interest in overthrowing the system because it exploits us. We could be getting far more than we are actually getting right now. We could be appropriating back to ourselves the value that we ourselves produce. And in that way, that is the next and final stage of evolution for Marx, for social evolution. The socialist form, the socialist mode of production, where each person produces according to their ability and each person receives according to their need. Last but not least, Marxism looked at the market and looked at regulation of the market as a secondary force, right? That the state was simply a product of the bourgeoisie's interest, right? And to a degree, I have some sympathy with that view. The state is, in many ways, simply a product of the modern state, I should say, is simply a product of the elite and their need to dominate the working class and to expand their interests out into the world. And so Marx's view of the market is that the state's regulation of the market is really neither here nor there and will be adjusted accordingly, according to the needs of the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, right? As we get into Brennerism, this neo-Marxism begins to break away from orthodox Marxism, largely because some Marxists had a little bit of trouble trying to understand how to deal with peasants, right, as a working class. And often Marxists don't treat peasants as a working class. They treat them as something else. They're certainly a producing class, but Marx viewed them as somehow distinctive and counter-revolutionary. The peasants would never be able to develop the sense of solidarity that international industrial workers would develop inevitably, because they're separated, they're displaced from one another, and because they're largely illiterate, they don't read. There's no way to connect them, right? There's no way to connect a peasant from northern England and a peasant from Italy. They'll never see each other as the same, if they even consider each other's existence at all. Peasants' point of view is local, right? And so their concerns are entirely local. The Brennerist approach is occurring in the 70s largely because, and he doesn't say this, but because of Maoism, which is this revolutionary movement in China that was built on the peasants. And it says it's so, Maoism claims to be another version of Marxism and another version of socialism, but correcting Marx to say, no, the peasants are anti-revolutionary. The peasants are actually a potential a potential source of a groundswell of revolution, if tapped properly. So Brenner is writing in the aftermath of those communist revolutions in China and in Vietnam and in Korea. And he focuses the class struggle and the mode of production on the on the mode of production wherever it happens. It doesn't matter if it's in the city, it doesn't matter if it's in the agricultural zone. Wherever value is being produced, there is a worker, right? That capitalism is not created by the condition of labor. Capitalism is created by the condition of exploitation. I'll say that again. Capitalism is not created by the condition of labor. It is created by the conditions of exploitation. A peasant is a worker. When that capitalist mode of production takes over control of that land, it does not change the position of the peasant. It simply exploits them at a greater level. Brenner follows the traditional Marxist path by juxtaposing French absolutism, which we'll talk about much later, with the development of classical capitalist relationships within England, right? Where the bourgeoisie have total control of the state, right? He says this capitalist aristocracy, this bourgeoisie, presiding over an agricultural revolution, which in turn brought about an upward spiral that extended into an industrial revolution. So Brenner says, look, it's not about agrarian versus urban. It's not about rural versus urban or agrarian versus industrial. It's saying the capitalism happens within the agricultural zone that then enables the industrial revolution to occur because of the increased production that you get from increasing the exploitation of peasants. The peasantry in medieval Europe had all kinds of protections. It was only after those protections were stripped away that they could be driven into the field with the lash of starvation, the threat of starvation, driven into the field to produce well beyond their normal capacity to produce, well beyond what was comfortable for them to produce, working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, right? Going from having, 120 days off a year, much like yourselves, to having nearly no days off ever, constantly being required to produce. That increases production, it turns out. And with that increased production, it allows for there to be fewer and fewer agricultural workers because you're using each one to produce more. It frees up labor for the urban bourgeoisie to incorporate them into factories. This is seen most clearly in the modernization of agriculture in England. So Brenner is looking at this from a localized perspective. He's saying when you have this is happening at a nation by nation basis, as the bourgeoisie begin to grow in power, they take control of the state, they begin to change the laws that protect the peasantry, transforming them into rural workers who are exploited to a maximal degree, which increases production, which enables you then to have your industrial revolution. Brenner does construct a little, he talks about Brenner constructing an ideal type of feudal peasant, which means Brenner doesn't spend a lot of time differentiating between peasants, say, in Germany or peasants, say, in France or peasants, say, in Spain. And I think, honestly, for his purposes, he doesn't really need to. The peasant in Germany and the peasant in Spain have very similar types of protections. Those protections look a little different because the cycles of agriculture in, say, Spain and, say, Germany are different, right? You're working at different cycles. Spain has a longer growing season. Germany's got harsh winters. There's all different kinds of things that come into play. You're growing different crops, probably. So the cycles of the season are different. So what those customary practices look like on the ground are different. But pretty much across the board, you have workers that are fairly well protected in their customary usages of the land, and ate quite well, right? Ate quite well throughout the Middle Ages. The market emerges within this structure, according to Brenner, right? The market emerges within this structure. If we look, sorry, I went too far ahead. If we look at the page 8 into page 9. Certainly one can claim that some peasants only sold products in the market in order to cover their monetary requirements, which were partially generated by the coercive demands of their lords and or state officials. In this way, some agricultural producers were driven into the market in order to obtain, via the sale of their production, the cash needed to meet their obligations, generated by extra economic compulsion of others, right? But why would feudal structures have inhibited the emergence of markets? Well, because peasants generally produce what they need where they are. They don't have to go outside of their own village for very much. I don't need to go buy wheat from the village down the road. I grow my own. I don't have to buy honey. I have honeybees that produce that. I don't have to buy apples. I have apple trees and orchards that produce that. I don't have to buy pork. I raise my own pigs. I don't have to buy beef. I raise my own oxen. I don't have to buy cheese. I make my own cheese. I don't even have to buy beer because my wife makes my own beer. If you're a medieval peasant, you make everything that you pretty much need. The only things that you're engaging in, unless you're forced to trade, the only kind of commerce you're engaging is for little luxuries here and there. You know, occasionally a village buys a bunch of cinnamon, pools their surplus agricultural produce, sells it to the urban market, and buys a little bit of cinnamon to put in the beer, or a little bit of pepper to put on the Christmas, the communal Christmas roast, right? They buy these little luxuries, but they're not heavily engaged in the market until they're forced to. And they're forced to by landlords who are transitioning from feudal lords into rural bourgeoisie. And by some of those peasants who were doing quite well, who transformed themselves into rural bourgeoisie. Landowners who did not want a surplus of grain. They wanted that payment in cash. They wanted the rent in cash, not in kind, as it's called. Primarily, according to Epstein, primarily market structures determine the character and the rate of economic development in a society. So essentially, according to Marx, how powerful the market is, how powerful the profit-driven commercial activity is within a society will tell you how far along in the stages of development a society is. By contrast, since property relations are only one determinant of market structures, one may not deduce the course of economic development from a reified structure of property values alone. Can't just look at how much land is worth and say, that's where you are in the stages. One cannot infer a peasant smallholder's economic strategies from his ability to subsist on his own land and his duty to pay rent to a feudal or other landlord. Rather, his economic strategies will depend on how his access to markets is structured. Peasants are not driven into the market. They go into the market sometimes. I should say this. Peasants are not always driven into the market. A lot of times, peasants will voluntarily become commercial producers. It gives them more freedom. It gives them access to cash, especially if they have large amounts of land that they have customary usage of. Going into the market can be quite attractive. If they're a small landholding peasant, if they only have say 20 or 30 acres, maybe not. Maybe going into the market would be damaging, it makes much more sense to consume what you produce yourself. But those peasants who controlled large areas of land and who had access to others were more likely to say, okay, I want to become a capitalist. I want to sell my product. I can buy luxuries that my father and grandfather, my grandmother, my mother, my grandmother could never have imagined. Right. Along with the role of peasants, one must also not minimize the importance of demographic changes in Western Europe. You have dynamic impulses of population that are affecting the usage of land. How much land is under cultivation? By how many people? Enormously important factor in determining who gets to grow food and how much food can be grown for what size of population. As we get into the modernization theory, we start to see a little bit of a change between talking specifically just about social relationships and modes of production and how modes of production are shifting. We begin to see a conversation around the kind of techniques of production of actually like industrial products, right? How are people transitioning from the rural to the urban? And it not simply in terms of like, oh yeah, you didn't need as many, like Brenner's like, oh yeah, you didn't need as many farmers, and those farmers get shoved into the cities. Modernization theory is very interested in, okay, how do we go from tiny medieval cities with very small populations to larger and larger and larger industrial cities, right? London goes from, in the medieval period, has a population of 10,000, right? By the early modern period, it has a population of nearly 500,000. It explodes in size. Paris goes from 50,000 to 1,000,000. Madrid goes from about 10,000 to about 300,000. You have these massive explosions. Augsburg, even not even capitals, but the city of Augsburg in Germany, what's known then as the Holy Roman Empire, goes from a very tiny hamlet along a river to an incredibly important trading hub. Venice, Florence, Milan, Genoa in northern Italy all increase in size. And where are all these people doing? They're making things. They're making iron products. They're making wool products. They're making weapons. They're making different kinds of tools to sell. They're making things. And so in modernization theory, what the proponents of modernization theory are interested in is looking at how those types of industrial production change over time and the effect that the changes in those production models change the entire society, right? This is what's known as, looking at the modes of production from a microscopic lens, saying, look, we start with the putting out system, right? Where you show up at a farmer's cottage, you hand him a bunch of wool cloth and say, you're going to make me pants. I'll come back next week to collect them. That's the putting out system, right? You give somebody a bunch of raw material, you come back a week later, they've transformed it into an agreed upon number of whatever. Nails, pants, shirts, jackets, hats, whatever you want, right? The putting out system is the kind of the first stage of industrialization. And in that stage of industrialization, workers have a lot of freedom, right? They're still almost like medieval peasants in that way that they are technically a part of the market, but they kind of have the ability to set their own work schedule. As long as you get all the pants done by the time the guy comes back, it's cool, right? You'll make your money and that's fine. And you also probably have a small amount of land that you're growing crops on to help feed yourself and supplement that income. But the putting out system is replaced by the factory system, where you have workers being taken out of those homes and required to produce in a central location. And this is, according to modernization theory, this is the turning point. Once the factory becomes the place of production, once workers are no longer producing in their own homes, but they are torn out of their homes and they are put into a factory space where they are controlled, that is what, that demonstrates the emergence of a new kind of capitalism they call industrial or modern capitalism, right? So modernization theory is very interested in that shift, right? They're also interested in the shifting away from guilds, the breaking of those workers, I should call them workers, those artisan groups of skilled laborers who banded together to protect themselves and to ensure that they had a dominant market share, right? Whether it was candle makers or bowers or people that made bows or cobblers or people that made or fixed shoes, um, or coopers who made barrels. They all had their own guilds, right? And guilds existed when you still had that kind of independent artisanal skills based early capitalism. But the power of the guilds is broken, right? By the bourgeoisie who changed the laws, who changed the rules to suit their purposes as they become more powerful and start to take over the state, right? So modernization theory, looking at the breaking of the medieval guilds, looking at the transition from the putting out system to the factory system as these kinds of stages of modernity. All right. I think that's where we'll end for today. We will talk about world systems theory later. I want to introduce that because we're going to be talking before you read Wallerstein, because Wallerstein is a world systems theorist. And I want to introduce the theory before you jump into actually reading some of his work. So awesome job. You guys are great. I can't wait to meet you all, and I wish you all the best. Bye, guys.